I'm John Cullen. Thanks for joining, Hypothetically Speaking. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at Koch's postulate. Koch's postulate has been at the center of a number of discussions regarding the coronavirus and the COVID-19 outbreak, SARS-CoV-2. And a number of doctors and specialist researchers have said that the SARS-CoV-2 virus has not been put through Koch's postulates. So in this episode, we're going to take a closer look at Koch's postulate. What is it? Why does it matter so much? Why is it so important? And who is this guy Koch? So first, let's take a look at that. Let's see if we can figure out who Koch is and why the postulate matters. And then we'll look at Koch's postulate and step through it together and see what we can learn. So Koch's postulates are 4 criteria designed to establish a causative relationship between a microbe and a disease. The postulates were formulated by Robert Koch and Frederick Loeffler in 1884 based on earlier concepts described by Jacob Henle. Now it says refined and published by Koch in 1890. Koch applied the postulates to describe the etiology of cholera and tuberculosis, both of which are now ascribed to bacteria. Etiology is the study of causation or origin. The word is derived from the Greek, giving a reason for. More completely, etiology is the study of the causes, origins, or reasons behind the way that things are, or the way they function. The postulates have been controversially generalized to other diseases, but it says citation needed. More modern concepts in microbial pathogenesis cannot be examined using Koch's postulates, including viruses, which are obligate cellular parasites and asymptomatic carriers. Citation is needed, though. They've largely been supplanted by other criteria, such as the Bradford-Hill criteria for infectious disease causality in modern public health. Again, a citation is needed. And Falco's criteria for microbial pathogenesis. So the Bradford-Hill criteria, also known as Hill's criteria for causation, is a group of 9 principles that can be useful in establishing epidemiologic evidence of a causal relationship between a presumed cause and an observed effect. All right, so we have the Bradford-Hill criteria, we have the Koch's postulates, and we have Falco's criteria. Now, molecular Koch's postulates are a set of so it doesn't really spell that out. We'll figure that out later. All right, so now we get into the postulates. So let's explore these together and see if we can find any evidence of this on the internet. But before we do, I found something after the diagram that I thought was interesting. It says later, however, Koch later abandoned the universalist requirement of the first postulate altogether when he discovered asymptomatic carriers of cholera and later of typhoid fever. Asymptomatic or subclinical infection carriers are now known to be a common feature of many infectious diseases, especially viral diseases such as polio, herpes simplex, HIV, and hepatitis C. As a specific example, all doctors and virologists agree that poliovirus causes paralysis in just a few infected subjects. Citations needed, though. The second postulate may also be suspended for certain microorganisms or entities that cannot, at the present time, be grown in pure culture. Viruses also require host cells to grow and reproduce, therefore cannot be grown in pure cultures. The third postulate specifies should, not must, because, as Koch himself proved in regard to both tuberculosis and cholera, not all organisms exposed to an infectious agent will acquire the infection. Non-infection may be due to such factors as general health and proper immune functioning, acquired immunity from previous exposure or vaccination, or genetic immunity, as with the resistance to malaria conferred by possessing at least one sickle cell allele. That's interesting. It says a citation's needed, but who knew that? There's resistance to malaria if you have one sickle cell? This is weird. Okay. Learn something new every day. There are a few other exceptions to Koch's postulates. A single pathogen can cause several disease conditions. Additionally, a single disease condition can be caused by several different microorganisms. Some pathogens cannot be cultured in the lab, and some pathogens only cause disease in humans. In summary, an infectious agent can be considered to be a sufficient cause for a disease if it satisfies Koch's postulate. Failing that, the postulates suggest that the infectious agent is a necessary but insufficient cause for a disease. All right, so let's take a closer look at the diagram itself, and let's step through them one by one and see to what degree has coronavirus met or not met the four Koch's postulates. So the first postulate says the microorganism must be found in abundance in all organisms suffering from the disease, but should not be found in healthy organisms. So it sounds like that's what Koch began with, but he said, but afterwards he found asymptomatic tuberculosis people, and so he said that's not really that pivotal, the kind of the second part. So, but the idea that is, if you're sick, they should find the organism in you, right? So if you're sick in the hospital with this disease, with COVID-19, and they draw blood from you and they put it in a culture, SARS-CoV-2 should grow somehow, right? I'm probably oversimplifying it, given that I don't know how to do that, but somewhere here there's a culture. And whether they're taking it nasopharyngeal or taking it from your blood or what have you, but the idea is the microorganism must be found in abundance if you are sick with COVID-19. So let's move to the next step. Okay, step 2. The microorganism must be isolated from a diseased organism and grown in pure culture. Now, we just read that when it comes to viruses, there's no such thing as a pure culture because the virus requires a host cell. So because of that, there's a little leeway here. But the idea is we want to get a sample from a diseased individual, probably nasopharyngeal, I imagine, and then grow that in a culture and see it in the petri dish. And that's the little diagram we see over here to the right that's red with the little white smears on it. And then the next step, number 3, is that the cultured microorganism should cause disease when introduced into a healthy organism. So in other words, that which just grew in that petri dish, if we could take a little bit of it out and scrape it out of there and then introduce it to a mouse, that's what they do, should cause disease when introduced into a healthy organism. So if you take it from one sick person, go grow it in a culture so that there's more of it, and then you take some of that and you give it to a healthy animal or organism, it should get sick with that same thing. It should cause the same disease when introduced into a healthy organism. Then, number 4, the microorganism must be re-isolated from that organism that we just gave it to that got sick. They call that inoculated, diseased experimental host, and identified as being identical to the original specific causative agent. Okay, so these 4 steps. Now, many doctors have been saying that they didn't do this. And I think the question that I'm asking when I look at this is, well, who didn't do this? Because my understanding is that the genetic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 was provided by the Chinese to GenBank on January the 10th. Did everybody assume that the Chinese went through Koch's postulates and said, yep, this is it, and here's the genetic code, and they published it on GenBank, and then did anybody in any other country complete Koch's postulates? Now, if not, what does that mean? And what are the ramifications of that? Does that mean that there's not a virus? No, it doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that we haven't definitively, assuming it hasn't been done, that there's no definitive evidence that this sequence of events was gone through with the SARS-CoV-2 virus into from a particular organism, let's say a human being, and then cultured, and then given to an animal that I imagine can also get it, whether it's one of these mice or these humanized mice they call them now in the lab, or whether they have to give it to a bat, or what, I don't know what that step is, but step 3 says if they give it to an organism, it needs to get sick with that same affliction. Now, have the Americans done this? Have the Canadians done this? Have the British done this? Is there any documentation of anyone going through these postulates? Or did we just take the Chinese at their word when they published the genetic sequence on GenBank that was it? In other words, there's a whole bunch of people sick in the hospital in Wuhan, and the Chinese said, yep, this is it. This is what did it. Trust us. If, in fact, Koch's postulates have not been met, what does that mean? Well, it means that SARS-CoV-2, the virus, may not necessarily be causing this horrific disease that we see people suffering from in the hospital. In order to say it definitively, we need evidence that the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the thing that we see in the microscope, we see it, it's real, I see it. The question is, did anybody do this? Did anybody go through this rigor? And are the only people who claim to go through this rigor the Chinese? And then they say, yep, this was it. Here's the gene sequence. It's on GenBank. There you go. And everybody said, wow, that's great. Thank you. Now we don't have to do all this culture work. Is that what happened? Now, if no one else has done this, what that means is that the sickness that people are suffering from is not necessarily SARS-CoV-2. In other words, in order you have to be definitive, it has to go through this rigor. I don't know if it did or it didn't. If it didn't, that opens up the door. It opens up the possibility that the affliction that people are suffering from is not being caused by necessarily SARS-CoV-2. Doesn't mean they don't test positive for it. Right? So of the 600,000 people that died in the USA, 80% of them probably would test positive for HPV, human papillomavirus. That's not what killed them, but they would test positive for it. Many of them would test positive for one of the herpes viruses or zoster virus. That's not what killed them, but they would test positive for it because it's in their system. With this, if these postulates have not been met, and the number one comorbidity in the United States is influenza, and we're not doing cultures, might the influenza be causing these terrible symptoms that we're hearing described that sound remarkably similar to the Blue Death of 1918, often called the Spanish flu, but also called the Blue Death? So if Koch's postulates genuinely have not been met, it doesn't mean that there's not a SARS-CoV-2 virus. It means that the sickness that we see people suffering from in the hospital is not necessarily that virus until we see the sequence completed. And if the only group of scientists that have completed the sequence are the Chinese, and everyone else in the world just took them at their word for it, well then, shame on us. Is that what happened? Hypothetically speaking, I'm John Cullen. Thanks for joining.